6:02 p.m. Go ahead and call this meeting to order. Mrs. Salazar, would you like to take roll?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Chairman Dylan Mojica.
Present.
Vice Chair Bodie Curvin.
Present.
Commissioner Mary Lowry. Present. Commissioner Tracy Quick. Commissioner Justin Acevedo is absent. Commissioner Janice Shumway is absent. Commissioner Ian Durnan is also absent, but we do have a quorum, Chairman.
Okay, so let's move to first item, which is a public hearing and consideration of case UP-22-02, a request for a conditional use permit to allow a two-unit residential land use in the C2 Intermediate Commercial Zoning District pursuant to Zoning Code 14-5-11 for the property located at 505 South 4th Street and 1006 East Ash Street, assessors parcel number 208-05-295. Dana, would you like to present the case to us?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Chairman and Commissioners, for hearing this item this evening. And there will be a public hearing as well. And I'll explain that as we get into this request. But we did receive this request to add a dwelling, essentially, or a one-bedroom apartment in an existing structure on the subject property, which is a single-family home with an accessory structure in the rear. And again, the applicant, I think he's probably owned the home for maybe about a year now, has a young family, and would like to have that additional space in their home. And he may be zooming in. If he's not, I did provide him the link. I do know he's got very young kids that he takes care of too. So hopefully he's going to be in attendance. He is aware. Oh, thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much. So that said, I'll quickly get you oriented. Again, it's a conditional use permit, and what that is a very unique type of use that operates in a zoning district that might need some sort of special conditions or consideration to make sure it functions well in its surroundings. And it stays with the land, so should an applicant or an owner that receives a conditional use permit sell his property, it rides with that land until there's some sort of violation or a revocation or a change in that use permit status. Otherwise, it would be essentially eternity unless there's a code change or something that negates a use permit. It requires public notice and public hearing, so we've met all the advertisement requirements for this request tonight. As well, conditional uses are allowed in a particular zoning district for a specific location, like I mentioned before, that requires some special conditions. So got that business out of the way. I'll take you right to the site here, and this is something from Google. Property, as you see, is in the center. It's circled in red or in a red rectangle. You see the main house. It's pretty prominent. 1915, I think, home. They're off of Ash Street, or Ash Avenue. And in the rear, you can see that guest structure, the accessory structure that they're proposing to convert to a one-bedroom apartment. Just to orient you, this is East Street School, East Globe School across the street, and then that is pedestrian crossing goes right directly behind the building to enter an alley there. As you may recall, you approved a coffee drive-through around this location. It looks like it's already coming up as the Coffee Bean Coffee. Has not opened yet. And then that building that the Copper Bean Coffee's Google symbol there is located at is actually an office, or was to be used as an office, formerly a pawn shop. And then you can see Chalo's is right is a block away, and then other commercial uses in a single family home directly across the street. Gives you the bearings, so it's existing surrounding commercial. This is the zoning designation. It's C2 zoned. So that's not our most intense commercial corridor or commercial that C3 is, but our zoning code doesn't provide a real drastic differentiation between those uses allowed in C2 or C3. The blue here you see is TR, our Transitional Residential Zoning District. That allows multifamily by right, single family duplex dwellings, as well as multiple dwellings. And then over here on the northeast corner here, west corner is NS, Neighborhood Services District. And that's a very similar transitional district that has some limited retail office uses allowed, as well as it also allows multifamily, single family, and duplex dwellings. As you know, the C2 that this is located in allows multifamily dwellings with an approved use permit. There's a little caveat to this. I explained in my staff report. The way the C2 and C3 zoning districts read is just as multiple dwellings. And multiple dwellings is defined in our zoning code as 3 or more units. Whereas duplex would be 2 units. There's duplex dwelling in our zoning code as well, and that's defined. So what this request is actually for a duplex dwelling. So you probably saw in my code, depending on this evening's your consideration and discussion, I do note that if you were to, we wanted to allow the applicant to make this request. This situation has kind of been on my mind, as we have a lot of older homes in commercial zoning districts. And I always thought, wow, they're kind of forced to go to 3 or more units in areas like Hill Street and other of the older areas near downtown. So I using it as an opportunity to kind of bring up that conversation as well. If you like this request, if this is something you'll ultimately support, I did note in my staff report that we would bring forward a text amendment to correct that zoning code or to update the zoning code to correctly reflect what might take place if you want duplexes also to be allowed in the commercial zoning districts. So with that said, here's a close-up there again, the property, the building, and then in around 1940 or 50, this building was built in the rear. From what I understand, actually the neighbor contacted me yesterday and provided me some background on the property. I guess it was a former judge, an attorney in town, and who eventually became judge. But this was initially his law office. I don't know that it was built for that, but she told me in the early 60s, late 50s, that was his law office in his backyard, fronting Ash Street there. And then our most recent business license for that structure expired in 2014 or 2015. It was an accounting office or a tax prep location. And as you can see, there really is no on-site parking on the property. When this house was built, this block was built, there were not on-street parking or on-site parking requirements, though 2 of the homes, or actually I think about 4 homes on this block do actually have some sort of off-street parking. Otherwise they utilize on-street. So that being a business there, that was interesting. I don't know how they shared parking or where patrons of the business would have parked or how it would have got there, but it was developed as a commercial building. And I think it's pretty evident. The applicant provided the site plan with all the dimensions, the setbacks of the existing home, as well as that apartment building in the rear. Apparently there's a workshop, and I think there was access, or there is access to the alley directly behind that workshop, and that's the office structure that was constructed. That's currently an accessory structure to the home. Again, it is C2 zoning, so the idea has been that it would be a commercial, or it would offer commercial opportunity. Here's an elevation or an image looking south from Ash. Again, residents on the right, and that building, which is clearly a commercial facade fronting Ash Street. We did receive a email from the neighboring property owner expressing some concern or concern over this request for parking. Apparently, she's had a history of issues with parking. Now, we do recognize Mr. Duncan, the applicant, the property owner, has only been in that house for a year. I understand there may have been more than one family previously on the property and consumed apparently a lot of on-street parking spaces potentially. And then I forwarded you the letter. I hope you all had an opportunity to see your emails today. If not, I'd be happy to bring it up or read it to you for the record if you'd like. And then she also expresses some concern over sewering. This subject property apparently would overflow, and the neighbors would blame the budding property owner, the opposing party, for aggravating their sewer situation. So apparently she had some history to explain to me. We couldn't find any with staff in our public works department. There was no recollection of an issue, but we do know that some areas of the city have common sewer lines where it's kind of a private line, though there is an alley here, where the way they're set up might overflow and cause problems for other people on that line. So anyway, but I'm not aware of that issue being presented from the applicant, and it might be able to shed some light on that, but we don't have record in City Hall, at least from the individuals at the Public Works Department that are familiar with any sewering problems there. But the concern expressed by the applicant, or by the neighbor, was that obviously adding an additional unit using more sewer could potentially aggravate that problem. And then there's going to be a public hearing after I finish my presentation, and we do a question and answer. So staff is recommending a motion to deny for the reasons of no on-street park or on-site parking available. It doesn't meet obviously the letter of multi-dwelling development on the site. And then in the final item I'll think of, I think I covered it already in the presentation, but those are the two primary items. In the event the commission wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions. And I bring this up, we also recognize the shortage of housing, and our recently adopted housing study explains that there is certainly a deficiency. So we want to make sure we bring this forward to you and have an opportunity to consider this from a policy standpoint. And as I mentioned in my staff report as well, should the commission deny the request, it is the applicant's right to appeal to city council too. So that's still an avenue for the applicant. But if the commission did wish to approve, I wanted to make sure we had some conditions of approval inserted to address potential concerns or issues that have been expressed, like the lack of parking. So I'll just run through them quickly. And proposed change to the site plan would require site plan approval, obviously. Number 2, the property owner shall not exceed a maximum number of 3 vehicles parked. So that's 2 for the family, the primary building, 1 for the apartment, parked within the right of way or on street on a continual basis. This excludes temporary guest parking of the same vehicle, not to exceed a maximum of 7 days in any 30 consecutive day period. So we want to make sure if the commission wishes to approve this or approves this, that there isn't a conglomeration or a car collection beginning out there between the existing property owner or future property owners and or renters in that rear building too. So we want to make sure there's some level of control over parking issues that could arise on the street. And that has been explained, may have existed in the past from that neighboring property owner. Item number 3 is just standard language. We're reiterating that if this building burns down or any part of this property burns down, has to be replaced. It needs to comply with existing building codes. All the accessory structure we're discussing is entirely in the rear yard setback and not compliant with any of our minimum building setbacks. Item number 4, all building permits necessary for converting the structure will be required, including building fire and city code policies. We need window exits in the bedrooms and things like that need to be approved and then inspected finally for a certificate of occupancy. And then finally, I did insert, in addition to what you have in your staff report, item number 5 to address a potential sewer issue. In the event the increased density on this property causes sewer issues on surrounding properties as determined by a licensed bonded plumber, property owner shall have 30 days to remedy the issue. Now, why that's in there is if there is a problem or ongoing problem, then that's going to potentially negate this conditional use permit. We'll bring it back up, bring it back before you for violation or not meeting those requirements. So with that, I'm available to answer any questions. And I would just again point out that Chairman, after we get done with our discussion, we'll just need you to strike your gavel and call opening, you're opening the public hearing. Anybody in the public wishes to approach the microphone, state their name and address, and they can do it at that time and explain what their thoughts are on this proposal. Very good. Let me know if you have any questions.
So regarding the parking and the sewer line, well, I guess mainly the sewer line. I'm not sure if the city of Grove would be too familiar with this parking, but as far as the sewer line, there's no documented evidence of that area having a specific sensitivity to what currently exists, at least.
Not aware, just from the neighbors' narrative.
And the primary home is already just a single-family residence.
Correct.
The subject structure is due to be turned into a duplex.
No, another unit, single apartment.
Okay,
Unit.
so
So between the two, it would be defined in our code as a duplex.
okay. So,
And that's a 20-foot alley beyond, obviously behind this home. It's consumed with the stairwell for the pedestrian crossing.
I have a question that I wasn't able to ask. Trying to understand. And I understand it, the C2 zoning code, which this is in. Currently, if a granted a CUP, they could have 3 or more dwellings on this. Is that correct?
No, it's going to be specific to what you approve. So,
Yes, I'm just gonna kind of see. It seems like the way our code is, it either allows for a single family dwelling, or I'm not gonna say family, I'm gonna say a single dwelling. Or if you get yourself a CUP, it could allow for multiple dwellings, which is, but I'm having trouble reconciling is why would 1, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 be allowed?
okay. So the fact that it's a single family residence right now is legal non-conforming. Actually, the C2 and C3 zoning districts don't allow single family homes. So this was constructed or zoning changed, probably was the case. Zoning changed along all of our highway frontages and then created a lot of legal non-conforming single family home situations, commercial zoning. So that's why in C2 and C3, it strictly says multiple dwelling because they're thinking, well, that would be the most multifamily development would be most consistent with commercial types of activities.
So like commercial, those apartments, and
I think that's the idea.
thinking of the land is used. Looking for the
Correct. because of its adjacency to arterial road. You have a lot of access, so we're not inundating a local neighborhood street necessarily. For all those reasons, multifamily, I think, is specified in the C2 and C3 districts.
So
Under use permit.
if this were approved, we're not original zone, we're actually. Now, if we ended up approving this, is that
Use permits are always case by case, but obviously you want to be consistent with your application and your philosophy. Yes. So that's why in my staff report, I note that we would bring a text amendment forward to offer that same opportunity to all single family homes in C3 if they want to go to have an additional unit, which possibly makes more sense than forcing people to carve up their home to 3 units or more, or their property in some way. I can see it both ways.
then and that means that, let's say in 20 years, there's over the next building. We can just read number of things on this property. The land, so we're not trying, this can only have 2 homes on it, future, then would increase it back to apartment.
Absolutely. So they could just approve a use permit for multiple dwellings on the property, or amend this use permit to expand it.
And then the last question I have is state of more city infrastructure. We have a lot of that are sewer lines. Today's decision. Don't want to be.
They just increased our PPP sales tax by 1%, and a lot of that is because they're dealing with infrastructure. So they're already thinking about that.
Good. Okay. Then.
And Dylan, I have a question, if I could too, please. Okay, so say they decided that we say no, you can't do a single family dwelling there, but they want to upgrade it and they want to put an office in there and make it commercial, which is what it was originally intended to. Would we then be discussing parking, or would we be figuring out where we would park people?
So it's zone C3, so they could propose an office. Now it's legal, or C2, I'm sorry. So yeah, office use is allowed. We would have a situation because of the expired business license. So if that was an office in the last 6 months, we would say, it's a grandfathered use. Wherever they've been parking, that's how it's been, since the 40s. It's allowed. But once that went dormant or expired, then 6 months pass is what our code says. We like to give people a little more leeway, but obviously 10 years, in leeway being other codes are like a year of inconsistent use. So in that situation, if they came in and said, hey, I want to start my office here, and I'm going to have people showing up, we would say we need to see the parking. We recognize before we can issue a business license, we need to know how you're addressing parking, be it lease land from the East Globe School and use the pedestrian bridge or whatever. I think it might be locked, but whatever it is. And Duncan, the applicant, is aware that he does have that opportunity to secure parking in another area if that was feasible, to be able to do that. So that's how we would look at it. Now, if it was a home office and they had very limited trips per day, I think, and they would explain that to me, less than 5 trips per day, we would treat it as a home occupation and allow that. You know, even though it's got a storefront and home occupations aren't supposed to have storefronts, it is what it is in this situation. We just have to analyze what that use would be. But I think there's some, you know, we're getting into a gray area of how to utilize that structure. So, but it's definitely constrained because it has no parking.
So Dana, I do have a question. So is one of the major reasons why you are recommending to not approve this at this time because of the lack of parking and the lack of ability to put on-site parking on this property?
That's correct. And that nuance to the code.
And then I'm going to guess this might be something that the property owner might be able to speak to. But with the bridge being in that location, I'm going to guess it's quite challenging to even consider. I know you mentioned that there used to be a thoroughfare where that workshop is currently, to even think about having that workshop removed and placing parking from that alleyway.
Yes. So Justin or Commissioner, I'm not sure if you recall the approval of the coffee bean drive-through, but we did have, we were going to utilize that alley for their trash receptacle. And we've since said, hold off on that. Let's not do that. I didn't realize this property could take access potentially. Not sure that would work or how that would work, but it is a 20-foot deep alley. It could possibly, we'd have to look at maneuvering, things like that, but yes. I think the owner mentioned it may have been some sort of parking location in the past, or it could have been used as a garage.
Yeah, I did drive past it last week, and it looked like it used to probably be a carport of some sort that was semi-enclosed. Thank you, Dana. I think that's all the questions I have at this time.
Okay, so, well, as long as we don't have any more questions, we can open it to public hearing. Let the applicant speak on his behalf. So, ready? We will open the floor for public hearing. Can you please approach the podium, please?
Dana, are you still with us?
Yes.
Oh. Thank you.
Can you hear me all right? To address your question, Commissioner Acevedo, the building does have a garage-sized door. But in order to pull a car into that place, it would need to be a small sedan, and it would need to travel like less than a foot in front of the overpass stairwell structure, which I do not conceive to be safe. Were there to be anybody walking down the stairs and the vehicle leaving at the same time, there would be a problem. I have two other items. I think we've not experienced the sewer backup in the way that the neighbor had described in the last 3 years we lived there. Three and 2/3 of the year, yeah. I don't think that turning this building into an apartment would significantly increase the sewer usage while we reside there. Can't speak for the future, of course. And then for my last item is that the parking is, yeah, I think it's pretty flexible because we have a lot of options. I have a standing agreement with the owner of the Copper Bean that we could use one of their spots for parking as long as, you know, their employees are able to park there. And we have other options as well nearby. Like the parking lot at the old East Globe School. I don't know if that would be allowed, but it is certainly an option we could exercise. That's all I have right now. Are there any questions that I can answer?
Do you actually have like someone like lined up to move into this, so it would give housing to someone that's here, or is it just something you're doing?
Yeah, we intend for that to be where my aunt begins to live. She is living in town currently, and we'd like to turn that into kind of like a mother-in-law suite and move her in there.
And have you experienced any problems with the neighbor that wrote the letter about parking and blocking the driveways and such, or is that all kind of past history?
We never discussed the sewer with my neighbor.
But the parking in the driveway, 'cause she also complained about cars blocking her driveway.
She's never addressed parking with us. I've personally, and my wife has personally never seen a vehicle blocking that driveway, although occasionally there are lots of vehicles parked along the sidewalk right there. So I think that she's probably not incorrect, but I don't think that it is a pervasive issue.
Really, could I direct a question to Dana while the floor is open for public meeting? The applicant mentioned, at least just kind of as a hypothetical or speculative scenario of potentially parking on the other side, and then, you know, presumably, crossing the overpass bridge to get to the parcel in question. What would it take to make that arrangement with the school? There could be an agreement between private individual and the school to perhaps utilize, as long as it's not a burden to the school, to use the parking lot on the other side. That is a real possibility to explore.
Correct. The city would require a shared parking agreement, something that we can enforce. And that makes the city a party to that agreement as well, that we can enforce. So yes, that is an avenue.
And is that just well, I guess you kind of mentioned that there's going to be some enforcement of that, but for the shared parking agreement, is that going to require its own agenda item that the council or planning and zoning commission may have to also deliberate and vote upon?
Quite possibly. I haven't done a shared parking agreement in a long time, and normally it's already negotiated in part of the approval process. So yes, if it's, you know, it just depends on how the city would like to approach it and how our city attorney would like to approach that. So I can't really speak to whether or not council has to actually take action on that. But what I would suggest is that we would modify one of those conditions, should you wish to approve this, and to include an opportunity to secure a shared parking agreement that's enforced by the city. And then if it needs to come back or goes on a separate item, which I don't think it would, to be honest with you. The city's not taking on any liability or asset in that situation. We're just receiving some formal level of permission. So I think staff could probably execute that, working with the applicant and the other property owner, providing the parking.
And then on top of that, one of my concerns is not just the applicant's application for a conditional use permit, but the opening. I understand it's a smaller structure, but the Copper Bean Coffee and their staff and patrons is the plan for access to the Copper Bean Coffee Shop that's supposed to be that would be 5th Street, correct?
Correct. And exits to the highway.
Okay, so there's one point of ingress and one point of egress for the Copper Bean Coffee Shop?
And then the alley.
Sure.
Yes.
But, and then the Copper Bean is drive-through only, right? So there's not parking for customers, just employees. Is that correct?
Correct. They can have I think they'll have a walk-up window for pedestrian traffic.
Dana, that makes me think of one more question. What is that building considered currently? I noticed on your diagram it was labeled apartment, but I wasn't sure if that was from the applicant, or if it's registered as a guest suite right now, or if it is registered as a business, or what that might be considered by the city.
Accessory structure.
So that could be used continuously as guest quarters, but essentially could not have a full kitchen build out in it currently then?
Yes, correct. A kitchenette of sorts could have to not have one of the no laundry facilities and a kitchenette, some sort of minimal refrigerator and sink prep area, no cooktop.
Right. I know stove is normally the big thing that kicks it over.
But yes, good point. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Coffee Bean is going to be using the same sewer. And that's all speculative.
So I do have at least one question for the applicant. You mentioned that maybe every once in a while the parking gets crowded, which is, I mean, sometimes that just happens everywhere depending on what's going on. Is there is there an identifiable trend or routine as far as when that happens? I mean, is it around Christmas time? Is there a certain holiday? Is there a day of the week where you may experience that heavier parking or traffic?
Yeah, it would be heavy like that on Saturdays, one or maybe two times in a month. We, my wife hosts like little scrapbooking parties, and then we also occasionally host our D&D sessions, and those always happen on Saturdays. So it would just be that one day a week, and it would happen either one or two times in a month, or I suppose 0 times in a month.
From what you've seen, even while that's happening, there typically enough room for one more vehicle to join what happened as far as Saturdays?
If it were to park, I do believe if we were to park closer together on that street, we typically give like 3 or 5 feet between vehicles. But if we were to park closer together, we would be able to fit one more vehicle without obstructing the driveway.
Hey, Commissioner, I'm the wife. My husband is, I think, forgetting that there's another side to the street. We do not ever block off both sides of the street. At most, we have 5 cars, and a good 8 can fit on each side of the street, and not blocking off any of the driveways. I also think these congestion issues that our neighbor is experiencing is more of a perfect storm kind of event. Everybody has a guest over, and when every home on that street has a guest over, and then we have 3 or 4, then it causes some backlog. I think I've seen our neighbor to the furthest south on our side of the street park along Monroe a handful of times in the last 3.5 years that we've lived there. 2 or 3 times in the last 3 years have we actually caused somebody, and I'm not saying that we have, but collectively the homes on the street have caused somebody to not be able to park directly in front of their home.
I guess it is one thing that I was kind of aware of. I work at the courthouse, and so I travel through Monroe Street. Fair amounts of off-street parking along Monroe, which is not incredibly burdensome to use. You know, you have to turn a corner and then the block the house. So I suppose it's not too awful to have to off-street parking on adjacent side of the area. But of course, the alleyway itself, that's 20 feet, right, Dana? 20 feet in width.
Yes.
And so relatively narrow enough to be alley rather than primary thoroughfare. But considering the options, it may not necessarily be as bad when you expand outside the scope of just the alleyway itself. And I believe the applicant had also mentioned you guys have some type of agreement with the Copper Bean Coffee Shop regarding parking.
Yeah, that's correct. I reached out to, I'm forgetting her name, but I spoke with her on the phone and I believe through email as well. And she agreed that we would be able to use a spot, not a particular spot, just a floating single spot that she does not expect to need in the normal day-to-day ongoings of the business and the nearby office.
And is that parking going to be utilized primarily or just on an as-needed basis?
I think it's hard to guess how my aunt would choose to park the vehicle. Given that the Coffee Bean parking lot would be much closer to the apartment, she might opt for that. But the 4th Street parking would be a lot more familiar to her, as that's where she parks when she visits now. I'm not sure.
We are also currently a single car family, so having his aunt park on 4th Street right in front of our house is no added burden on the street as it stands. So while we live there, she could absolutely park in front of our house for as long as we live there. We don't need the coffee shop for her to park.
And are you planning on staying in this property for at least some number of years?
For the foreseeable future.
I personally can't say no because of a parking issue. I own a business downtown and parking is my life, trying to figure out what's going on. So one parking spot to say, especially when we need housing and there's someone set to do it, and no offense, but that's kind of a little eyesore. It would be nice to see it cleaned up and throw a paint job on it and everything. So I personally can't use parking as a reason to say that no.
Is a dense scenario, we're always going to have parking.
Absolutely, and it's walkable.
Yes, and I'd like to just mention that after really thinking about it at first, you know, maybe I was focusing on the alleyway, and it felt like it was getting pretty tight, but expanding it to all options, again, I think it may not be as burdensome as what it initially might appear when you first mention it. And I suppose if it ever did come to that, then something like an enforceable or defensible parking agreement of some kind somewhere could be an option. But I mean, even if it does feel a little bit dense, sometimes that happens. I live on a one-way street, and but we work. There's probably more options, whether it be Monroe or Fourth, and you mentioned that whenever your aunt comes over, she typically parking on Fourth Street anyway.
Yes.
And okay, so it's I guess if you're talking about parking within the alleyway, it makes it seem tight. But if there's parking along Fourth Street, and if that's routine, then it seems like the parking within the alleyways is may not be the most common route or method of parking for the area. So again, maybe for the certain events you maybe have Saturday, maybe there's enough warrant or cause people to stack up and park in different areas. But if that's relatively infrequent, then the amount of congestion may not be as bad as it seems. Even if you are wary of that, as mentioned, within a commercial zone, sometimes parking like that just whenever there's activity. Is there anything just in general you might like to add to statements or anything?
I would like to reiterate one of the items that I calculated a little while ago, that there's space for 10 parking spaces on site on 4th Street without obstructing any driveways, and we would go from like 6 dedicated to maybe 7. And that's only on the one side of 4th Street without considering Monroe or across the highway or the coffee shops. That's
Enough space for 10 vehicles. And well, yeah, the applicant may know just by experience, but Dana, this for 4th Street, this is I can't recall, is it parallel parking or is it the canted adjacent type like perpendicular parking?
It's parallel. I think there's some cars parked right now, or in this image. And I have a parking discussion in my staff report for you. And it identifies a certain number of parking spaces that are available on street. And that's based on a few things that we need to take in consideration from a planning perspective. First, it's actually a traffic violation to park within 30 feet of an intersection. So we take out 60 feet right there from the block from being able to calculate that into the traffic or into the parking, available parking. Now keep in mind, a 25 by 25 corner cutoff is required at corners where we don't allow any obstructions between 2 and 8 feet. Now I know you'll say, well, that's all over town, and it is. It's all over every town. But from a public safety standpoint, that's actually a thing. Site visibility, triangles. So that kind of is why I think there's a traffic law requiring no parking within 30 feet of an intersection. Number one. So I did an analysis just looking at what's all the available parking and then extract the driveways, because obviously you can't park in front of the driveway. And then I utilize a calculation that's consistent with the city's parallel parking space design, which is actually like 21 feet. So like Duncan said, if people have smaller cars, they tend to park closer together. Motorcycles park perpendicular, maybe, things like that. So, but I have to take a conservative, utilizing our traffic safety standards and zoning code requirements for parking dimensions. Hope that helps. And my calculation, looking at this image, this home on the opposite side of the street has 2 parking spaces. The home next door has 1 parking space. So I calculated all the available parking on site and off site, or on site and on street, on this block to determine. I think I came up with 2.9 spaces available for each home. When you tabulate all the existing parking. Now, this gentleman on Monroe has a large garage. I would only imagine that's not full of cars, maybe. But sometimes garages, it's hard to tell if they actually utilize it or not. But they tend to be more storage than anything these days. So anyway, there's an expansive conversation on parking. But in my conservative calculation, find there could be 3 spaces available per home on this block.
And that would put it at a total of 8 spaces along 4th Street.
Let me see what I came up with there, given those calcs.
From the first sentence, 5 of the 7 homes on this block provide on-site parking for.
Yeah, there's our on-site spaces, 10 spaces on 4th Street. So that would be 5 and 5 on both sides. You can see you could probably get more. Keep in mind, again, there's driveways, and then there's that 30-foot or a total of 60-foot on both ends of the block that we technically aren't allowed to park. So I came up with 10 spaces totally available on street on 4th Street, meeting laws that we have in place, traffic laws.
That is good to know about.
There you go. You don't have to learn the hard way. I don't know how our BD enforces that, or if they enforce that or not. Usually it's community choice.
Well, from what it looks like on the aerial image, I think I might see 1, maybe 2 that could already be in violation of that along 4th Street, but I suppose if that's just kind of how it's always been, then, they're deceased.
Either way, we calculate could be up to almost 3 spaces per unit when it's all totaled up on the block.
So does that affect anyone's perspective on parking? It's 30 feet from an intersection, right? From corner, basically.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
60 feet on each side, which without that 60 feet is a good amount of space. Park several more vehicles, so that is cool. For anyone who's further inside or think anyone.
How I feel.
Take that something else to say. I say we close the public hearing and we make a motion.
Did you have a response to the discussion we just had with Dana?
Nothing important.
Well, if you said all that you would like to say, we'll probably move on by closing the floor and with the discussion amongst the floor is now closed.
Dana, I'd like to make the motion to approve. Do I need to read all of the following conditions as well?
No. Approve with staff's recommendations in this presentation. That includes that sewer item. If that's
Yeah, I added that, right, yeah, I've even jotted that down. So unless someone's got something to say, I'm ready to make a motion.
I'd like to just kind of make sure the room's settled and everything for the applicants. Was there something that you needed or?
No, they're waiting to hear what we have to say probably.
Okay.
I think little kids remember.
Okay, sure. Well, sure, yeah. Well,
I'd like to motion that we approve case number UP-22-02 to allow 2 residential units on the lot in the C2 Intermediate Commercial Zoning District. Should the commission wish to approve this, we're going to also include the staff recommendations with the following conditions, including number 5 that was added, which is the sewer issues need to be dealt with within 30 days.
I second that motion.
motion has been seconded. We shall move on to call for the vote. All in favor, say aye.
I
Aye. Aye.
Yeah, did we lose Justin?
Aye. Just gets a little loud with everybody.
I like that tie.
Any opposed? Motion is unanimous. Well, vote is unanimous, motion passed. So, second matter of business is a presentation from staff regarding recent changes to short-term rental legislation in Arizona and discussion on potential short-term rental regulations in Globe. Discussion only. Dana?
Thank you very much, Chairman, Commissioners. I know I've teased you a little on this item this year, and we're moving forward with our short-term rental ordinance. And just as we decided to do this, obviously, coincidentally, the state legislature made a couple adjustments to short-term rentals. But I'm going to quickly run through and just give you the big scope of what to expect for a short-term rental, and we hope to have some language before you for recommendation to city for consideration and out to the public for a citizen review meeting and discussions, and then before you for a public hearing. What this entails is, again, Airbnbs, short-term vacation rentals, basically any rental of a home or residential property for a period of up to 30 days. For the most part, it's not that specific, but it's not a long-term rental, and we know 30 days is definitely on the short end of things. But so most likely what's going to happen is the city code will be amended, not necessarily not the zoning code, but the city code under the business license section. Well, that's where that legislation is typically contained, because it has a registration and licensing requirement, including taxes, both a TPT or a transaction privilege sales tax, as well as a bed tax that applies to those that should council wish to adopt that type of policy or ordinance. So just really all the language would sit under a business license, just very similar to we did, I think the last big business license amendment that was done was for medical marijuana, and how that tax is collected, how we so forth, how we issue those business licenses, because it's much more in the licensing side of the world than the use necessarily. And if it were in a use side of the world, it'd be more of a zoning realm. So we know it's a single family home, how the state wants us to treat these are. They're single family homes. If you're a dwelling and it's a legal dwelling, then why can't anybody go stay in that for a short period or something, given they meet all the requirements of being licensed and pay their taxes and be a good neighbor too, which is the big push. So I don't know how much you all are exposed to issues with short-term rentals, but I know in Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, other areas with very large homes, they're basically targeted for entertainment venues out of their short-term rentals. Well, the state legislature recognized these problems, these difficulties in neighborhoods, and had recently said, okay, we need to take another stab at allowing cities greater flexibility in legislation to be able to have penalties and stiffer fines and requirements for Airbnb tenants or rentals that are a nuisance in the neighborhood. So basically what we'll end up with is, again, a registration licensing requirement, pretty straightforward. We'll have a map. We'll know where they're at. One of those requirements is that you always have somebody available within a 60-minute period to respond, a manager, a property manager, or property owner. Otherwise, then you could potentially lose your license to operate an Airbnb. Operating requirements not used for non-residential uses like event spaces or banquet halls or special events, restaurants, sober living homes, or housing sex offenders, etc. They can't exceed the approved number of dwellings on a single property. So one of the provisions is that if they're similar to the last request we saw, if Mr. Hull decided to Airbnb his main residence versus his now second dwelling there, it would have to be under the same license or under the same renter, if you will, not separate. And now all of a sudden we've got two families on one property like that with the cars and all of the activity that might go along with that. Now his example is probably not the best because it's a very small lot, but as you know, we have some larger lots in other areas that probably do have guest houses or casitas and things like that, that other cities have imposed these types of restrictions to keep them from becoming aggravating the traffic in a neighborhood outside of that residential character that we work hard to preserve. Must provide a minimum required on-site parking spaces, must be lawfully established dwelling, no campers, travel trailers, unless it's in a camper travel trailer type zoning district, a district that allows that. Comply with property maintenance codes. We'll reiterate that through that language. And then that violation section. And this isn't this is very different than a zoning code. Typical zoning code, because it has penalties and fines, or I'm sorry, violations and penalties. And when cities adopt those, the state statutes require a 60-day advertisement period, a different set of, whenever you're penalizing or creating a new enforcement provision and fine provision, that has to go through a whole separate public hearing process or public process for review. So anyway, in the violation section, again, owner, manager must be available in person by phone within 60 minutes of being contacted. And then we're going to fold in and figure out exactly how we can impose the recent updates adopted by state legislature, which really are fines, extensive fines. I think it was up to $2,500 for a single unit, $3,500 for a larger home, or the cost of one night's rent, whichever is greater. So that's the gist of the language that was approved. If you saw that and read that in that link that I had sent you from Arizona Republic. And then finally, again, penalties and enforcement section that'll go in, and that'll take a bit of time to work through with our attorney and city council on how exactly where we'll advertise and get that out. So it's pretty simple. They're a pretty straightforward section because of the reins that are put on cities in imposing legislation against or prohibiting them or regulating them. So it's pretty straightforward for what we're seeing, and you'll see that, I think, in the next month. You'll see language, and we'll go ahead and kick that off. I'd be happy to respond to any comments that you have or that you'd like addressed through this process as we're getting started. That's it.
Surrounding community make these decisions. We'll do that with this as well.
Absolutely.
Out of curiosity, do we know how many Airbnbs, VRBOs, all those fun things are operating in town currently?
We don't. We're aware there are a handful. Don't know how much, but we'll do that homework and have a good understanding and probably start to make some contact and build a stakeholders list to make sure that they're part of the process.
That sounds great.
I guess related to that, it would be hard to know without, the administration of the business license, but if there are some that are currently in operation and all of this legislation goes through, I mean, is there any sort of grandfathering in, or does any existing Airbnb and so forth then have to comply with these the business license and the legislation?
Well, once we create a new licensing process, then we'll have a sunset clause maybe in the ordinance, or a sunrise, that as of this date, if you're operating, you need to get registered with the city and receive a license. Because as of right now, I'm not aware that the city would require a business license or anything like that from an entity. So that licensure process would basically bring them into the fold. So no is the long answer to that. From what I see, now our attorney might have a different opinion, but I believe there won't be any grandfathered. Either you're doing the business or you're not, and you're required to pay taxes and get registered and licensed.
Fair enough. Thank you. Well, I don't think I necessarily have any more questions or comments about that one. That one was just a discussion. But Shelley, with that being a discussion, do I have to formally close that one? Do we have to have a motion to move past that one, or do we just move on? Okay, okay. Future agenda items and scheduling of meetings. Does that go to you, Shelley? Oh.
Chairman, commissioners, as of now, there's a lot of talk and hopefully a conditional use permit possibly coming forward for converting a older motel complex in the community to residences. Outside of that, maybe a wall. Our code is unique in that it allows for a conditional use permit for special walls, as it's noted. So I'm just pointing that out to one of the commissioners. But other than that, we're very busy. A lot of great projects coming through. The old Napa building's getting renovated. None of it, they're not making any changes to the structure, but they just submit a comprehensive sign package to build a beautiful, modern, multi-tenant sign structure and repave the parking lot, as well as give us the landscaping that probably once existed out there along the ADOT frontage, but they're going to reinstitute that. So the Safeway's been, or I'm sorry, the old Safeway, I think might repave and do something similar and update the property. So we just have a lot of activity, just none of it kind of falls in the site plan approval purview because there's not really new structures where I think we're turning over older structures and rehabilitating them or repurposing within the code. So that's good news and hopefully it continues. But as of now, nothing else on the agenda except for we also want to look at expanding the historic preservation overlay district, or we have looked at that, and we know it's a desire of the city council and other stakeholders. So we hopefully will, we might have a fall here of policy work for you. That's it.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dana. That concludes tonight. There's the kind of for the adjournment. Motion's been seconded. This tonight's meeting is now adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.